Welcome everyone to another episode of Se Regalan Dudas. We're very excited to finally be able to also do this in English. It's amazing to find all these amazing people that can talk about such interesting things and to be able to go back and forth Spanish, English. Today we're very excited about our guest. Her name is Amy Morin. She's a clinical social worker, a psychotherapist, and an international best-selling author of many books, but the one that we read recently was 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. Welcome, Amy, to Se Regalan Dudas. We're very excited to have you here. How are you handling this quarantine time?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I'm handling it okay.
The first thing I love about even the title of your book and everything I've read is how sometimes we don't know what to do or what we like, but when you start talking about the things you shouldn't do or you don't need to do, it's also another way to start finding yourself or to start finding interesting things. Why was it that you chose, instead of saying what you should do to be mentally strong, why did you go through the route of what people shouldn't do?
A couple of reasons. So, number one, as a therapist, I was taught I should build on people's strengths. When they come into my office, I should point out what they're doing well and tell them to keep doing that. But at some point in my career, I thought, I'm doing people a disservice if I don't point out some of their counterproductive bad habits. And I thought, if I went to a fitness trainer and I wanted to become fit, and they told me to run on the treadmill, that'd be great. But I'd be upset if they didn't tell me to quit eating junk food, because I want all that hard work I put in on the treadmill to be effective. And if I ate too much junk food, I wouldn't see the results. So it just became clear to me. Sometimes I need to point out to people, hey, this one or two bad habits that you have is counterproductive to all of your good habits. But also in my own life, when I've gone through the toughest times in my life, the last thing I wanted was a lengthy to-do list. I already felt overwhelmed. I felt like I was doing as much as I could. And if somebody handed me a long to-do list and said, hey, you should add all of this stuff to your day, I'd just feel worse. And so I thought, sometimes when we're going through tough times, we just need to know what are the things not to do. And for me personally, when I woke up in the morning during the tough times in my life and I said, hey, just don't do these things today and you'll be okay, it felt like it was much more doable and accessible, rather than thinking, oh, I have to do 101 things today to get through it.
I love what you said, that you started with just one or two things, that sometimes when we're feeling overwhelmed or something like the quarantine right now, we want to do 10,000 million things because I feel like we are brought up with the idea that the more you do, the more you're valued. You know what I mean? And there's like this pressure on doing. And I love what you did, that you were like, I just needed to do two things. And those were enough for right now.
That's it exactly. I think we put so much pressure on ourselves. We feel like we have to be busy and you always have to be doing. And it's all about, what did I accomplish today? How productive was I? And then you think, well, in the end, what's it all for? If you're running around all day long getting things done, well, did you actually accomplish anything, or did you just focus on being busy? And because somehow being busy makes us feel important, or we feel like our time is well spent as long as we're constantly doing. But I don't think that that's really the goal in life, is to say, how fast can you run? How much can you do? How much can you accomplish at the end of the day? There's no prize for the person that got the most done.
Totally. And I don't know if it's possible, Amy, for you to do like a little recap of, I love the introduction of your book, how you actually came upon these 13 things and sort of your life story in a way, and how you got connected to everything you later write on, like the self-pity situation and all of the 13 things.
Yeah, sure. I come by this list honestly, because sometimes people say, oh, you accomplished all of these things, you don't do them anymore. And I have to explain, no, actually, I wrote this list because I do all 13 of those things.
I master all of them.
Right. So yeah, my career started out as a therapist, and I thought, great, I'll teach everybody all this stuff I learned in college based on these textbooks and all this information that I gleaned from my classes. But early on in my career, about a year into my work as a therapist, my mom passed away suddenly. She had a brain aneurysm, and she was healthy one minute and then gone the next. And when I lost her, it was the first major loss I'd ever had in my life. But something I had already learned as a therapist was sometimes people go through tough times and they would grow from it, they learn from it, they become better. But other times I would see people who became bitter and angry and they got stuck and they felt like their life was never able to be good again. And I didn't want to become one of those people that felt angry and bitter. So I thought, all right, how do you go through tough times and learn from it? And so I wanted to grow. And grief is such a weird thing. We don't talk about grief. We're not comfortable with grief. And our tendency is to avoid all of those feelings that get stirred up with grief. But I knew that the people who did that were the ones who came into my office 20 years after a loss, and they'd say, I've been waiting all this time to feel better. When will I actually feel better? And they were waiting. They weren't doing anything. And they had bought into that notion that time heals everything. So they thought if they just waited long enough, they'd suddenly wake up and feel better. And so I knew that time didn't heal anything. It's what you do with your time that matters. And so just started studying people in my therapy office to figure out what's the difference between people who heal from their pain and grow from it versus the people who get stuck. And pretty early on, I realized it was more about what people didn't do rather than what they did. If people didn't have certain bad habits, they could go through tough times and they seemed to come out better and stronger because of it. So I thought, all right, how do I now apply these things to my own life? And then 3 years later, 3 years to the day that my mom died, my husband, 26 years old at the time, died of a heart attack. And I found myself a 26-year-old widow. I didn't have my mom, and I thought, now what do I do? I'm supposed to be a therapist who helps people, but my heart was broken. My life was in shambles. And luckily, by then, I had figured out, okay, just don't do certain things, and you'll be okay, and you can get through it. And so I really focused on what not to do. And that's what got me through the toughest times in my life, was just don't do these things, and you'll be okay. And a few years later, my father-in-law was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I found myself in this place of thinking, this isn't fair. I shouldn't have to lose someone else. I don't want to go through this. And, if I'd learned anything, it was that self-pity is what keeps you stuck. And so I sat down and I wrote a list of all the things mentally strong people don't do. And it was those things I knew that I'd learned from being a therapist, but I learned throughout my own experiences. If you just don't do these things, you'll be okay. Number one on the list is don't feel sorry for yourself, because I was in the midst of hosting a pity party for myself. And when I was done, I happened to have 13 things on the list, but I read it over to myself as much as I could. And I thought, all right, this is helpful. If I read through this list, I feel okay. So then I thought, well, maybe it'll help someone else. And I published it online and thought maybe it would resonate with a couple of people, but 50 million people read that list. And before I knew it, people wanted me to write a book, and I, changed the course of my life to now be able to talk about mental strength and the bad habits that hold us back.
I love your story, and I love the number one that I feel it's so important, because I've found that what we tend to do the most is self-pity ourselves and believe things are happening to us, regardless of us having any sort of power during the situation. But when I wrote your first chapter, when it says that we firmly believe that these things that are happening to us are unfair, and we walk with that thought in our minds, like, this shouldn't be happening to me, like if there was some sort of mistake in life that just kind of like didn't happen to formulate the numbers correctly, and you got this, unfortunately.
Yeah, we tend to think, I got a raw deal. This isn't fair, that somehow the universe is against me. And we create these stories about how our life is horrible and awful, and our problems are bigger than everybody else's, and nobody understands. And that's where we get stuck. And, it's so important to allow yourself to be sad and to allow yourself to be angry and to go through tough emotions. But when we start to feel sorry for ourselves, that's different. That's when we start to exaggerate how bad our life is. We get hopeless about the future. We feel helpless because we are convinced nobody else can help us. And that causes us to stay stuck. And when people develop that story about themselves, that they're just unfortunate in life, and no matter what happens, they're doomed to have bad luck, sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We stop trying to do hard things. We stop putting ourselves out there. We stop taking the risks that would make our life better. Instead, we just stay stuck in a bad place.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the part I liked the most was how, because then again, you read a lot of stuff, especially when I was growing up, I read a lot of stuff about motivation and like self-improvement. And a lot of it was just to like put away the uncomfortable emotions and the bad feelings, the ones that have bad press, and just pretend they're not there so you can keep moving on, and all of this positivity, like even toxic positivity, I would say, because you're just hiding or a part of you. But I feel like what's amazing about this book is it never invites you to that. It always tells you, you know, go through the uncomfortable feelings and emotions. It's the only way you can get through them. Just leave what what you're feeling at the moment. If you're feeling sad, if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling whatever. But then this is all the things that you can do. Like, just don't dwell and don't stay there, but don't hide them either.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions is people will sometimes think if you're mentally strong, you're happy, or nothing bothers you, or you pretend like you don't have any pain. But that's not true at all. I mean, it takes more strength to allow yourself to feel sad or to let yourself go through those tough emotions than it does to try to suppress them. And that's the big difference between being strong and acting tough. Is sometimes people will say, oh, nothing bothers me. Of course, stuff bothers you, and it should bother you. And allowing yourself to be bothered and to be sad, to be uncomfortable is part of growing stronger. And so absolutely, I think we just need to work on what coping strategies do we use? How do we deal with anxiety? How do we deal with fear? How do we deal with sadness? And it's about finding healthy ways to cope with those emotions, and then knowing that just because you're sad doesn't mean you have to stay stuck in a place of sad. You can move through it, but you don't have to stay stuck there and allow yourself to feel bad forever.
Totally. Another concept that you have on your book that I love is complaining. I think we become masters at it. I was talking to my roommate the other day, and if you come from a family that complains a lot, it's kind of like a gene pool that comes with you, because then you don't even listen to it anymore. It happens it's just the conversation and the topic that is always there. And we were talking and she said to me, that happens to my family. We don't even notice anymore. My mom complains, then it's my dad's turn to complain, then it's my turn. And I get to say all of these things. And so I just wanted to talk to you about, like, how has complaining emphasizes the victim and the unfairness that we believe that is happening in our lives, but also becomes a way of life that's kind of acceptable. That, oh, she just complains a lot. That's just who she is.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that it does. It just becomes normal. You point out all the bad things that happened in your day. And then when that happens, you forget that, certain good things happen too. But you sort of screen those out, or you think, well, that was a fluke, or just because, I happen to have that little piece of good luck doesn't mean my life is good, and we overlook them. And there's this common misconception that venting or complaining somehow gets all the bad feelings out and makes you feel better. But the studies are pretty clear. The more you talk about all the bad things in your life, the worse you feel. And it just fuels all of those unhealthy feelings that get stirred up and all that discomfort, and keeps us stuck in a place of anger and frustration and sadness. And so you just want to pay more attention. How much do I complain? Are you complaining about the weather? Because sometimes people will complain when it's raining, but then they complain when it's too hot, or they complain when it's too cold. I mean, they're never going to be happy. So it's important to say, how much time do I spend complaining about the bad things versus how much time do I spend looking at the positive, and how much time do I spend talking about the good things that happened in my day? So you might just ask yourself at the end of the day, if somebody were to say, how was your day today? Do you automatically name all the things that didn't go your way? Or do you tend to focus on the things that went well, and to make a shift to be able to say, how can I become more aware of some of the positive things that are happening in my life if that's been a habit that I am a constant complainer?
Yeah, and also I was trying to see out of this 13 things what we can use more now that we're all quarantining in different parts of the world, or most of us are staying at home. And there's a couple that I'd like to see if you can tell us more about. The one about they don't shy away from change. I think change is inevitable in life, but especially now. A lot of people are fearing that things are going to change, that nothing's going to go back to the way it was, as if it was something bad, right? Maybe grieving the life we had before to the life that it's coming soon. And also the one about don't fear alone time. So most of us are now spending a lot of alone time. And since being alone has a lot of bad press itself, instead of seeing it as something positive and as something that we can learn a lot from, is seen as depressive. So I don't know if you can talk farther about both of these, of trying to relate to what we're living at this moment.
Absolutely. So the first one, mentally strong people don't shy away from change. So
I shy away from change. I shy away from change.
It's
I
tough,
hate
right?
change. I hate it.
So often we just dig in our heels. We want things to stay exactly the same. And, I'll see it with therapy clients who will say, well, at least things are predictable, or at least it's uncomfortable, but I'm kind of used to being uncomfortable. So, I don't want to make things worse, because if I were to take a new job, if I were to end my relationship, if I move to a new place, it might be worse than it is now. And I don't want to make things worse. So I'll just settle for what I have.
Here.
And certainly right now, I think so many people are just looking at even small changes, like what if we have to wear a mask in public? What if we can't have these large events? What if we can no longer do some of the things we used to enjoy doing? My life is going to be bad. And when you start making those predictions, it makes you feel bad. And then when you feel bad, you dwell on the negative. And then the more you dwell on the negative, the worse you feel. And that affects your behavior, because then you think, I can't handle it. You convince yourself that you are not capable enough, that you don't have the skills that you need to deal with discomfort. You can kind of talk yourself into shrinking and not doing a lot of the big things that could make your life better. So when it comes to change, it's about recognizing that you're adaptable and that you are capable of making change, and that even when change happens, it doesn't have to be worse. Sometimes it can be better. Sometimes it's just different. It's not better or worse. And just opening up your mind to those possibilities. And then when you can, it's about taking one small step at a time to say, how do I face something that's a little bit uncomfortable? And then we grow confidence in ourselves that, okay, I can handle this. But it's really about catching those thoughts right now. If you're thinking this is going to be awful, this is going to be horrible, how do you reframe that? If you're doubting your ability to cope, it's going to be so uncomfortable, or I'm going to be lonely, I'm going to be anxious, I'm going to be scared, whatever it is. So about then reframing, okay, what's the evidence that I can handle it? Or what would I say to a friend who is feeling this way? We're usually much nicer to our friends than we are to ourselves. So you can give yourself some of that same advice. Give yourself a pep talk to really push you to face some of those things.
And also just being able to see that for anything to grow, like if we even think about, I don't know, a plant, a butterfly, whatever, anything that needs to grow needs a change. If everything stays the same, it's never going to grow. It's never going to become more beautiful, better.
That's it exactly. I love those analogies. Flowers, butterflies, everything has to grow to get better.
Yeah, I would avoid it at all cost if I could.
There's a saying in Spanish. I wouldn't know exactly how to translate it, but there's like our moms and grandmas would say it a lot. It's better something bad that you already know that's something new that you don't know. Like that's how we even can think sometimes. Like stay in a relationship that maybe doesn't work just because you want to avoid the uncertainty, then risk having a better relationship, a beautiful person in front of you, just because you don't want to change.
No, and I think... Go, Amy, sorry.
Well, absolutely. And when we're anxious, when we're sad, we just dwell on all the bad things that could happen and we forget about the good.
Yeah. I also think when it comes to change and time, I think it plays like this role perfectly, because I take so much time to accept change, like any type of change, and I don't respect the time. I tried to do all of these. When I broke up, I would call Letty and I was like, okay, I'm going to cry until Sunday. And after Sunday, I'm just going to be perfect. And on Monday, I'm a new person. I'm exercising, eating well. And it's like, it doesn't work like that, because I had the idea of all the things I had to accomplish to get over a breakup, instead of just don't doing a few and just allowing myself to sit on the uncertainty that change brings. I can't do it. It's too painful for me. It takes a lot of time. I'm getting better, I feel.
And that's a pretty common one that we want to put a timeline. We want to know, when am I going to feel better? And then we try to put an exact timeline on it and then force it to happen. And then to your other question about alone time, because mentally strong people don't fear alone time. But obviously right now, so many of us are forced to be much more isolated than we normally would. And with the studies, we tend to think of alone time as bad. We think anybody who spends time alone is weird, or they're a loner, or we use alone time as a punishment. We put kids in timeout, or somebody in prison goes to solitary confinement. And so we tend to think that being alone is really bad. It's punishment. And for a lot of people right now, they're struggling with all of this isolation and social distancing and things that they're going through. So I think it's important to recognize that alone time doesn't have to be bad. It's a wonderful opportunity to get to know yourself better, to get to be more comfortable in your own skin. There's studies upon studies about the benefits of solitude, from it can make you more productive, to make you more creative, to helping you actually become happier when you're comfortable with being alone. And so I think for a lot of people, just to switch their mindset, instead of thinking that being alone automatically means you're lonely, that you can recognize, okay, I can be alone and figure out, how do I be comfortable with it? You don't have to be escape loneliness all the time. Sometimes you can just say, I'm going to allow myself to be alone. And if I feel lonely, that's okay. I can handle that. And not to say you don't want to make sure you're connecting with people, because you do. Social time is just as important as alone time. But on the other hand, to just be alone with your thoughts sometimes. Let yourself feel uncomfortable, but let yourself unplug from social media for a little bit. Take a little break from all the constant noise around us. Turn off your TV and just sit and be alone with your thoughts for 5 or 10 minutes. For some people, that idea is terrifying. We feel pressure to be busy. We feel like we need to be doing something, or it's just so quiet it almost feels eerie. But whether you meditate, or you practice yoga, you write in a journal, or you just sit and think for a few minutes every day, it's really important for our psychological well-being to do that sometimes. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes, the more comfortable you become. But after a while, the better you know yourself, and the more comfortable you become with who you are.
Totally. I feel like sometimes we're just, in Spanish we say piloto automático. I don't know, how would you translate it, Ash? Automated pilot?
Autopilot. Like you're on autopilot.
Yeah. So I feel like sometimes we're leaving like an autopilot. Like every day is the same. We're repeating every single thing. We don't even stop to think why we're doing the things we're doing. We're just getting busier and busier every time. We are exhausted. And to me, one of the most interesting things about everything you've written in this book is just how to make small pauses to ask yourself these small questions about even the habits your mind has. Like, what do I usually tend to think? How do I punish myself? How do I self-pity? What do I think about the success of other people? What do I think about myself and my own life? Like, I just think that we don't even stop to think and to analyze how our mind is working. And we just assume it is the way it is, as if it couldn't be any other way.
Exactly. We get so caught up in the day-to-day hustle of life that I think we forget to take a step back sometimes and really think about it. And we spend so much time planning certain things. You might plan a wedding, or you plan a party, but you don't really plan your life, or you don't really think, how do I want my day-to-day life be different? So sometimes just taking a few moments and asking yourself those questions and paying attention to the small changes you might want to make, the habits you want to break, or the bigger picture of life. Are you living according to your values? Are your priorities in line with the way you want to live? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe just a few little shifts that you could make could really make a big difference in your life.
Yeah, and we don't talk about it often. Like, everybody goes to the gym every day. They understand that they got to strengthen the muscle, that it's an everyday work, that you got to show up every day if you want to see it change. But I don't know how it was for you, but for us, we grew up with no information whatsoever, with no way of analyzing our own mind, our own habits. And it is a practice you got to do every day. Like, it's not only what I found out at the end of the book. It's a very interesting book, but if I don't go back and if I don't actually do the things that it says here and show up every day in whatever it is I want to work on myself, there's not going to be a difference. You know, there's not going to be a change. Just by acknowledging it doesn't mean it's going to change.
Right. I try to make it clear that my book won't change your life. Reading my book won't change your life. But the work that you do after you read the book, once you have the information, you have to apply it. And that knowing something and doing something is two very different things. And even as a therapist, I had the information intellectually, but I still had to figure out how do I apply this to my life on an everyday basis.
Totally. I want to talk about a concept that you talk a lot, Amy, that is owning up to your mistakes and making it a constant conversation to talk about mistakes, not only in our life, but with the people we surround ourselves. And that part you said earlier where we're not as nice to ourselves as we are as nice to our friends. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea of like how we tend to hide mistakes and how we tend to hide all the times we took wrong turns or we stopped or we paused because we only tell the finished story but not the whole journey that brought us to you writing this book was a whole journey and not only a moment in time that you just woke up one day and wrote 13 things.
Yeah, we tend to look at people who are successful and we know, okay, that they made it to the top, but we forget how many mistakes they made along the way. And a lot of people don't want to talk about that. And we tend to put just as much effort into hiding our mistakes as it would take to own up to them. And then we don't learn from them because we're embarrassed by them. We don't want anybody to know. So we sort of like sweep them under the rug, or we pretend it didn't happen, or we put all this effort and energy into covering it up. And then you have to cover that up. And then we get caught up in this vicious cycle. So whether we're talking about, you decide you set a goal for yourself, you're going to get healthier, you're going to pay off your debt, you're going to make a big change in your life, and then it ends up not happening. Sometimes we make excuses. We put all this time and effort into pretending like, oh, I didn't care anyway, rather than just saying, hey, I messed up and here's what I learned from it, and then moving on. Instead, a lot of times we get stuck when we make a mistake. It's embarrassing, it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it's hard to even admit to ourselves, I messed up.
Yeah. There's a couple that hit me really hard. I think those are the ones I need to work the most on, maybe because my personality is based around them. But they are people don't give away their power and they don't worry about pleasing everyone. And this one, both of them hit me really hard because I just figured out that every time I'm complaining because someone is doing something in my life, or, my boss, or I'm not getting hired, or my work, or whatever, without acknowledging it, I am giving my personal power to someone else, my attention and my energy. And without knowing, I am so invested in these explanations and these stories I tell myself that instead of using all of that in my favor to, work harder or learn more or be present with myself, I'm just using it with other people. But it's hard to see because you think you're the victim here. So, and also being a people's pleaser. Like I'm in a recovery for approval holics, I would say, just trying to remind myself that I can approve myself and value myself, and that's all right. I cannot please everyone around me.
Yeah, they don't give away your power chapter. That's probably the one people want to talk about the most, or the people will say had the biggest impact on them, because it's one of those things that once we get into that habit of doing, it's hard to take back your power because we let other people control how we feel about ourselves, or how we think, or even how we behave. And then that often goes hand in hand with people pleasing, that we want to make other people happy. We think we're in control of how they feel because we let other people be in control of how we feel. So then we think, if I can make this person happy, I will. And then we end up losing sight of our own values, and we stop really expressing our opinions and doing the things we want to do because we're so busy trying to make other people happy.
It's a full-time job to make other people happy. It is. You're left with no time for yourself if you're pleasing everyone that is around you.
And there's a lot of interesting studies on people pleasing too, but one of the biggest problems with people pleasing is it drains your willpower. So when it comes to your own goals, you have nothing left over. So when somebody says, I'm trying to pay off my debt, or I'm trying to lose weight, or I'm trying to get healthier in my life, often we'll take a look at that, why you can't reach your goal. Sometimes it's because you've given away everything to everyone else and you didn't save anything for yourself. So self-discipline completely goes out the window.
Yeah, totally. And with the personal power, there's a story in the book. I don't know if you can sort of tell it. The one about the mother-in-law, because most of my friends are married now, and I think it's a constant story about how it can be your mother-in-law or your own mother, or like other families get so involved in the process of your family that sometimes it just becomes overwhelming and you're complaining the whole time without knowing that you're giving your own power to them. So if you could tell us this story, because I loved it. I think it's so clear how we sometimes don't see how we lose our own power.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the stories I hear most often in my therapy office. I hear from a lot of women who talk about their mother-in-law and sort of the feeling like their mother-in-law is overbearing and overtakes everything that they do, criticizes their parenting, wants to, criticize how they clean the house, comes over to the house too often, comes over unannounced, and feeling like I can't handle that, I don't know what to do, or my mother-in-law makes me feel bad about myself. So in the book, I share a specific story about that, but I have to say it happens a lot, that people will say, my mother-in-law criticizes my parenting and I don't know what to do about it, or my mother-in-law shows up unannounced and then makes these sort of snarky remarks about how I keep the house or what I should be doing differently. And people will say, and that makes me feel really bad about myself. So then my goal is to help them figure out, how can you still manage how you feel about yourself, even if somebody else does have some comments that are not very kind sometimes, and taking back your power, saying, I'm in control of how I think, feel, and behave, regardless of what the people around me are doing.
Amy, I wanted to talk to you about something that we at least me, has changed my life completely, and it's routines. Is being able to have some sort of discipline and some sort of a daily plan. Maybe not very strict, but just kind of organize myself to the degree where I know where my time will go and where my energy will go. What would you think about routines and the way we organize like our daily time?
Yeah, I think so much of what we do is habit and we don't even think about it. And so sometimes it makes sense to take a step back and say, how am I organizing my day? What kind of a routine do I have? And again, just making subtle shifts in the way that we deal with things. Sometimes people just automatically go to online shopping when they're bored, or they go to the kitchen and they end up eating when they're bored, or they have certain routines, they eat the same thing for lunch every day, but they don't really think about it. So sometimes it's about taking a step back and saying, what are my habits? Which ones do I like? And which ones do I want to shift? And once you make certain things become a routine, like going to the gym or working on a relationship, then it just becomes easier. You don't have to put as much mental energy into your day, and make sure you're actually doing all those healthy habits that you want to incorporate into your life.
Totally.
Sure. There's one of the 13 things that I feel our community, our social media community, is gonna love if we talk about, because most of the direct messages that we get are about fear. A lot of people want to do a bunch of things and have beautiful ideas, or have a plan or a project in mind, or dreams, I don't know. And for some reason or the other, they're very fearful and they think they won't accomplish, or they won't do it the way they've imagined, so they don't even start, or they don't even begin. And in the one in your book that says they don't fear taking calculated risks, I loved how there's many questions or many steps that you suggest before taking the risk. Because it's not just telling people, go ahead, go for it. Like, if you dream it, you can do it. It's also saying, okay, now that you have this huge idea in mind, or this huge dream, these are the questions you can ask yourself. And this is how you can make a cost-benefit analysis in order to make a decision. Can you guide us through a bit of these questions and how you came up with them and how have they worked in your personal life or in your consultations?
Yeah, so one important question to ask yourself when you're looking at a risk is, how am I feeling about this? Our emotions play a huge role in the risks that we take. So we think if something feels scary, it must be really risky. But that's a terrible way to assess risk. If you think, okay, public speaking, it seems really scary, so I better not volunteer to do that. But there's really not a risk involved in public speaking in terms of a physical risk. There's a risk in, say, driving your car somewhere, but we don't fear that, so we do it every day. But yet we think getting on a stage in front of 50 people is terrifying, so we don't do it because it feels too risky. So sometimes it's just about saying, what's my emotional state? And to recognize I'm feeling really anxious, so that's going to impact my willingness to take a risk. Or sometimes when we're excited, that impacts our willingness to take a risk too. We jump in without thinking about the bad things that could happen because we're so excited that we only focus on the good things and we become convinced that we're destined to win. So that's why people sometimes say fall prey to a get rich quick scheme, because they thought they were destined to win because they were so excited about it. So ask yourself, how am I feeling about this? And then to take a look at the pros and cons of taking the risk, but then the pros and cons of not taking the risk is really important, because sometimes we only look at the pros and cons of taking the risk. Well, maybe this business venture will work out, so I should do it. But then ask yourself, well, what if I don't open this business? What if I don't launch this product? What are the pros and cons of that? And writing it down, I always encourage people, write it down. Something about seeing it on paper just helps you to be a little bit more logical about it. So to ask yourself, what are the pros and cons of not doing this versus the pros and cons of doing it? Write it down and then assess your feelings. How am I feeling about this? And figure out how do your emotions affect your willingness to take the risk too.
And also the questions that I loved about the best case scenario and worst case scenario, right? Because sometimes you just see where you are today, but I think it would also help to see, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen if I just try this thing that I really want to do? If I just, stand up and speak publicly or go to an acting class or start this project that I have, and what is the best thing that can happen if it actually becomes what I wanted it to be? And I feel that helps you a lot to, make a balance and say, okay, I'm going to go for it, or maybe not today.
Right, because sometimes we think, I shouldn't do that because it might not work out. Well, follow the question through. Well, what would happen if it didn't work out? Let's say you got on stage and you forgot all the words to your speech. Well, then what would happen? Or if you asked for a raise and your boss said no, what would happen? Or if you tried something new and it didn't work out, well, then what? Sometimes the outcome isn't that scary. Well, so I'd feel embarrassed, or I might feel bad. Well, that's okay. You can handle feeling bad. And then
or I might get a no, but you already have the no. Like if they say no, that's where you are already.
Exactly. And so that's why it's important to then ask the other question. What's the best case scenario? Maybe somebody would say, yes, that could change my life. Maybe it will go better than I expect. So kind of just to argue the opposite with yourself and to figure out that whatever you believe is going to happen isn't 100% destined to come true. There are a lot of different options, a lot of different outcomes, and that can just open your mind to those other possibilities.
I love what you say about writing stuff down, because I feel that sometimes we forget why we do certain things. And it's so important to revisit who and why we took that decision. Like sometimes I find myself, we encourage a ton of journaling and a ton of actually putting your stuff on paper, because I later feel that sometimes we're like, why am I doing this job? Or why did I left everything to pursue this thing? And if we don't either remind ourselves or revisit it, it's difficult. And you go through a lot of writing exercise through your book, and I really like it because I do think that putting it on tangible paper does change and does help completely afterwards.
It does. I think it really helps our brain sort of make sense of things and to step back and just look at it versus just all the jumbled things that are running through our brains. We can see things a little bit differently when we actually write them down.
Totally.
And before we go, Amy, one of my last questions is this 13 things that mentally strong people don't do. I I think seem amazing, but a little bit overwhelming if you want to do them all at the same time, right? Especially because sometimes I feel like we can get the information and we understand it and it's amazing, but you say, okay, one thing is to read this, another thing is to apply it. So how would you suggest to make the transition? Is there a specific order? Should we just try to see which one we lack the most or we might start working on? Or how would you suggest that we start making the small changes? Because if we try to do them all at the same time, it's definitely not going to happen. I think you even go into the New Year's resolution, and that's when you say it usually doesn't happen because it's not like we're putting a time limit that has like no reason. Like it's not, I don't know. What would you say?
I would say, every chapter I start with a little quiz to help you sort of assess how big of a problem this thing is in your life. So I would say then to pick just pick one of the 13 things to start with. Pick the one maybe that you struggle with the most and then figure out, okay, what am I going to do differently? And when you give up that one thing, after a while you become more aware of when you're doing it and how it affects your life. And then you can focus on just that one thing. And then once you stop doing that and it becomes more like a habit, it's much easier to say, okay, I'm going to continue to not do it. And then you pick something else, but absolutely start with one small thing at a time. So often we say, I'm going to change my life starting next Monday. And then Monday rolls around and we're just too overwhelmed
I'm that
right.
person.
We're all that person.
By Tuesday, we give up because we're overwhelmed and you can't sustain it. So
because the new life is too much.
Right, exactly. So just start with one small thing and then it has the snowball effect. Once you give up one thing and you stick with it for a long time, then you build motivation, you feel better, and then you feel like doing more and it builds this momentum. So start small with just one small thing.
All right.
Thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate that you took the time to talk to our listeners about this book that I think a lot of them are going to like and are going to be able to use it. It's very practical and very down to earth, and I love that are things that we can do on our daily basis, and I really, really appreciate that.
Thanks so much for having me.